I'm Tricia Miller of Camera's Partnership of Christians and Jews. Thank you for joining us for this podcast. Camera is the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, and it's the oldest and largest media watch group setting the record straight on Israel and the Middle East since 1982. Camera's Partnership of Christians and Jews provides a powerful response to anti-Christian and anti-Jewish voices in the global media and other relevant contexts. I want to talk today about two things. The first is one of the foundations of Evangelical Support for Israel. The second is one of the reasons that support is under assault by enemies of Israel. The importance of evangelical support for the Jewish state is recognized across the political spectrum in Israel. It is also acknowledged by the vast majority of evangelicals worldwide. One of the foundations of that support is the understanding that evangelicals have of the relationship between God and Abraham. In Genesis 12, God promised to bless Abraham and make him a great nation. In Genesis 13, after Abraham arrived in the land of Canaan, God repeated the promise of descendants and told Abraham that all the land he could see would be his and his descendants forever. In Genesis 15, God cut a covenant with Abraham and repeated the promise of possession of the land of Canaan. A covenant is a formal agreement. It's a binding contract, and it usually involves commitment and obligation between two parties. However, in Genesis 15, God's the only one who takes the steps that indicate commitment to the covenant between them. In other words, God alone is responsible for fulfilling the covenant. The covenant is not dependent on anything Abraham does or doesn't do. This is an important fact to remember in light of the frequent charge that Israel and the Jewish people have lost the blessing of God because of something they've done or something they haven't done. In Genesis 17, the covenant between God and Abraham is repeated. And for the first time, the covenant is called a Berit Olam, an everlasting covenant. Here again, the covenant emphasizes descendants and land. An understanding of the significance of this covenant is an essential part of the foundation for evangelical support for Israel. The reality that God made an everlasting, eternal covenant with Abraham and his descendants through Isaac and Jacob is emphasized over and over throughout the biblical text, throughout the prophets, the Psalms, and the Christian Testament. So what does all this have to do with Israel today? The fact is that physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Jews who have been dispersed all over the globe for over 2,000 years, are now returning to their historic homeland. And evangelicals recognize that what is happening through the Jews returning to the land of Israel is a fulfillment of all the prophecies found in the Hebrew prophets. Now to my second point. Why is evangelical support for Israel under assault? Israel's enemies understand the importance of Christian support for Israel and recognize that in particular, American evangelical support for the Jewish state represents a major obstacle to their efforts to turn the United States against Israel. So they have developed a long-term strategy that targets evangelical hearts and minds. It's based on bad theology and rewritten history. The rewritten history will be the subject of another podcast. The bad theology is what I want to address today. Ever since the first generation of the church, after the time of the Apostle Paul, some church leaders have taught that Christians and the church have replaced Jews and the nation of Israel in the purposes of God. This theology is now known as replacement theology. Replacement theology can only be maintained by a faulty interpretation of Scripture that contradicts the understanding of the concept of covenant, a concept that is consistent from Genesis through Revelation, as demonstrated by the covenants made with Noah, Abram, Moses, David, and the new covenant revealed through the Christian Testament. Unfortunately, A misunderstanding of covenant in relation to Israel and the Jewish people is quite prevalent in the church today. This misunderstanding is the result of erroneous biblical interpretation that says Israel and the Jewish people have lost the blessing of God as a result of disobedience. Indeed, the Hebrew prophets have a lot to say about the consequences of Israel's failure to keep God's covenant. But they also have a lot to say about God's promise to return Israel to the land as evidence of the eternal covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The bottom line is this: adherence to replacement theology denies the eternal aspect of the covenant God made with Abraham. The belief that something God called eternal is not really eternal calls into question the faithfulness and reliability of God. In other words, in order for a Christian to believe in replacement theology, they must be able to explain why an everlasting covenant is not really everlasting. And they must then be prepared to believe that the new covenant they believe in is no more reliable or trustworthy than the Abrahamic covenant. That should be a frightening thought for any Christian who's thinking. And finally, the Christian who believes that God has no further purpose for Israel or the Jewish people must then be able to explain how the Apostle Paul didn't really mean what he wrote in Galatians 3:15 through 18, that the Abrahamic covenant is bound to the character of God, and thus it cannot be broken or annulled. In conclusion, believers in replacement theology use this erroneous belief system to delegitimize Israel's right to exist, in contrast to evangelical supporters of the Jewish state who understand that when God makes an everlasting covenant that includes the promise of a people and a particular land, that covenant really is everlasting. Please share this video with others so that they can be equipped to counter the false theology used by Israel's enemies to weaken evangelical support for the Jewish state. Thank you.